Hello, in today's video we'll be replacing the front brake pads and the rotors on the Chevy Colorado, which is the same procedure on the GMC Canyon. We'll want to start by removing the front wheel, and for this we'll need a 19mm socket. You'll want to make sure that you loosen all 6 lug nuts while the wheel is still on the ground. Using a jack, you'll want to lift the truck to the wheels off the ground and place a jack stand under the frame. And now we can completely remove the wheel. Using a screwdriver, we'll want to stick it in the rotor hole to keep the hub from spinning, and loosen these 6 bolts holding the rotor to the hub. You just want to break them loose, that's all. Using the 13mm socket, you'll want to loosen and remove the 2 bolts holding the caliper to the bracket. Now that the bolts are removed, we can slide off the caliper. We can now slide off and remove the brake pads. Now we'll need to remove these 2 caliper bracket bolts using a 21mm socket. These bolts will be on here really tight, so the longer the ratchet or breaker bar, the better. Once you get both bolts removed, the bracket will just slide off. We'll now need to remove these brackets and clips holding the wheel speed sensor line, starting with this one using a 13mm socket, followed by this next bracket using a 7mm socket. We'll have to unclip the following 3 clips that are holding this line. For this we'll need to use a flat blade screwdriver to slide it into the slot and push down on this tab to unlock the clip. To get to the connection, we'll have to push in on these tabs that are holding the bracket. You'll need to squeeze in on both sides of each one. Now you'll want to get the bracket out and push in on the connector tab to disconnect it. Now you'll want to pull out the wheel speed sensor line so it doesn't get caught on anything. As you can see, I use a caliper hanger to keep the caliper from falling off or tugging on the brake hose. Next we'll need to loosen and remove the 4 bolts holding the wheel hub rotor assembly. And for this we'll need a 15mm short socket and a deep socket. This lower bolt is the harder of the 4 bolts to remove. What I do is rotate the steering wheel all the way to the left so you get enough room to fit a deep socket, and this makes it easy. And now that we got them all loose, we can remove all 4 bolts. And now that you got all 4 bolts removed, you'll want to wiggle the hub free. But you'll also want to be careful with the cable to make sure that it's not getting caught anywhere. And also, if you pull the hub straight back, it can damage the sensor cable. So when sliding it back, you'll want to angle it by tilting the bottom out first. Now that we got the hub assembly off, the backing plate will just slide off. But you'll want to make sure to place it back on the same way. After that, we can flip over the hub assembly, so we can remove the 6 bolts that hold the rotor to the hub. After removing all 6 bolts, we can flip it over to remove the rotor completely. Before installing the new rotor, you'll want to compare it to the old one to make sure that it matches. After verifying that it matches, we'll want to clean the rotor with brake cleaner to remove any anti-rust coating that it may have. And you'll want to flip it over to do the other side as well. And we can now reinstall it back onto the hub. And you'll want to hold the rotor up against the hub as you reinstall the bolts. You don't want to tighten them that much since we're still going to add Loctite to them once it's back on the truck. And we can place the backing plate back into position. And this is why you don't want to reinstall it or remove it straight back. It's got a raised area that can damage the sensor or the wire. So when reinstalling it back onto the truck, you want to be careful with the wire as you place it back into position, lining up the bolt holes as you do so. And you'll want to put a little bit of blue Loctite on the 4-wheel hub bolts when reinstalling them. I find it easier to install the bolts hand tight to get the hub into position before adding Loctite, and then remove the bolts one by one, adding Loctite to them so you're not struggling to line them up with Loctite on the threads. When you're tightening and torquing these bolts, you want to do so in a crisscross pattern. And now to prepare the brake caliper bracket. The first thing we'll want to do is remove the old brake hardware and install a new one. You'll want to wipe down the area where they sit, or if it's really uneven, use a little Scotch-Brite pad. And the new hardware just slides into place. With the new hardware in place, we can remove the caliper pins and clean them before adding brake lubricant. On this one, the seal got stuck on the edge, so I had to remove the pin and use a pick to remove the seal. You'll want to clean the pin of any of the old lube, dirt, or grease that it may have. If needed, spray a little brake cleaner and then wipe on some new brake lubricant. And you'll want to repeat this for the next pin. You'll want to give the rotor a quick wipe down in case you got any oils on it when installing the hub. And of course you'll want to do the backside too. We can now install the brake caliper bracket. You'll want to use blue Loctite on these two, but I like to get the bracket into position first and then add the Loctite. And we can now torque the two caliper bracket bolts. We're now ready for the brake pads, but before installing them you'll want to add brake lubricant to the edges and the back of the brake pads, where the caliper presses against. You can use the old brake pads as a guide to find the contact points where you should add brake lubricant. You'll want to repeat this on the inner brake pad, but the contact point will be different. And now to compress the brake caliper to accommodate for the new brake pads and the rotor. This one is a 2-piston setup, so if you have a single spreader type, you'll want to use an old brake pad and go back and forth compressing the pistons in. When compressing the caliper, you'll want to keep an eye on the brake master cylinder fluid level. Since the fluid is pushed back in, you don't want to let it overflow. Now that the pistons are compressed, we can reinstall the caliper and install the two bolts. And we can now tighten and torque them. And now to add blue Loctite to these 6 bolts, removing each one by one. Now you'll want to keep the hub from spinning using a screwdriver and torque the bolts in a crisscross pattern. We can now reinstall the wheel speed sensor line, tightening the bracket and reinstalling the line onto the clips. Now that we got all that done, we can pump the brake pedal a few times till it barely travels. And now all that's left is torquing the wheels. Well, I hope you found this video helpful and informative. If you did, please click that thumbs up to support my video and my channel. And please subscribe if you haven't done so.